written called Spectrum Our History. As we moved into our anniversary year, we felt it would be a good idea to finally record as much of our history as we can. That started as about a 20-page document and has since grown to a 350-odd page book, which Leslie will model for us now. That's okay, we'll model in front. Feel free to model in front. I'm sure that's more interesting than anyone looking in this direction, for me anyway. Sorry, that wasn't an insult. Anyway, so we've launched a book which is our history, and I'll just go through it very briefly now. We have as freebies we've got a mug and a memory stick and an enamel Spectrum badge for all members and guests who are here today to take, and the history book will be on that memory stick along with a couple of other things I'll talk about in a minute. We have got 2 printed copies that we'll make available on the front desk at the end of this for you to leaf through, and we will now, we had those 2 printed before it was proofread simply because we didn't have time with a print deadline, so we're going to get a longer run printed in the fullness of time. The book, as I said earlier, comprises of around 350 pages, and that sounds like an awful lot, but actually it's still only a fragment of the organisation. We've been around for 30 years, we do different things every year, and trying to capture that and the people involved is quite a task, and so I see this as the beginning rather than the end of a process. It became quite clear early on that we knew very little about one of the founders of the organisation, Simon Brissenden. We've named one of our conference rooms after him for many years. Simon was a person that we all knew founded the organisation, but we knew very, very little about him. And we put as a dedication to Simon in the book one of his more thought-provoking quotations. And it says, "Those disabled people who have achieved independence in our society usually have done so through a process of struggle that continues day in, day out. Yet the benefits far outweigh the disadvantages of the struggle, and the struggle becomes less difficult as more and more people assert their right to independent living." Now that quote was put together in 1984, at the same time that Spectrum was founded. Seems to me those words are just as relevant and just as thought-provoking today as they were back then, and the more I got involved in this book, the more I realised a lot of the stuff that we talked about and the principles that founded the organisation are just as relevant today, and actually in the current climate become more and more relevant to disabled people. The book originally was going to be like an A to Z of the organisation, from 1984 to 2014. It became quite clear early on that actually there were many facets of the organisation that probably wouldn't have worked very well just as an A to Z. And so what we've done is we've split the book into a number of different areas. I won't go through all of them now. But what we've tried to do is to look at what disabled people's lives were like before SCIL, as it was then, was founded. And so we've got a section that looks around the history of disabled people and disabled people's movement before 1984. We then do a chapter on what 1984 was in a social, economic and environmental sense. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. Spectrum just didn't materialise out of thin air. It happened because of all the things going on. It's a miners' strike, if you remember, in 1984 as well. And so we've done a section around what else was going on, because as I say, Spectrum was a product of its time and it was influenced by what else was going on. We've also done a chapter on the birth of independent living. We talked earlier about John Evans, an event we did for him in January. It's no coincidence that independent living movement is the same age as Spectrum is, give or take a year. And so we've done a segment on John's story, and that seems to me very relevant today, as many disabled people are seeing many more barriers being reconstructed than we've been used to in recent years. And then we get on to our history, the 1984 to and 14 scenario, and there's a big two-chapter segment to that. But also, when we did it, it became clear there's a whole series of subjects that couldn't really neatly fit into that kind of narrative history, and so we've done a whole series of spotlights, what we're calling spotlights, and so there's about 10 chapters, I think, of spotlights. So for instance, there's a spotlight on Simon Brissenden. We've interviewed 4 people who knew him very well, and indeed there are a number of other people that we could still interview to find out more about Simon. So for me, a very interesting 40-odd page segment around Simon. So we now know 1,000% more than we ever used to know about Simon. I think there's still a lot more to find out there. There's also a list of all the management committee directors that we've ever had, and slightly from memory, I think that's 58 directors over the years. We've also got a close to definitive list of all the staff, volunteers and student social workers that we've ever had. When you add all that up, it comes to, I believe, 320 odd people. I'm not going to know why I'm looking, because I'm the one who wrote the damn thing. I think it's 300 odd people. And my point is, Spectrum is the sum of its parts. You know, that everyone who's had a role in the organisation has had a contribution to the organisation, no matter what those roles. And I think it's important that we note those people down, because it's obvious without those people we just would not be here today. We've got other spotlights as well. You'll be pleased to know the bit about the financial history is mercifully small. I think it's only about 4 pages long, since it's always the most stimulating part of the AGM. We've chosen, or I've chosen, to keep that bit very short. What we've also done now is we've republished some of the papers that the organisation has published or been published through our associates over the years. So there's a republishing of some of those papers, and as I said earlier, some of the really early stuff is just as relevant as today. It's just amazing how forward-thinking that was. But we're also republishing Simon Brissenden was a poet and a philosopher, and it's a real shame that he died in 1989. Who knows what extra contribution he would have made had he have lived longer and older. But what we have chosen to do in this book is to republish both his main poetry books. So we've republished those as a spotlight, quite a big spotlight. They're quite big books. They use the poems are very thought-provoking, and they use language of Simon's choosing, which some people may find sharp and bruising and uncompromising, but we felt it was right and proper that we should republish those in their entirety, and that's in the book as well. So you can see there's loads of pages. We've got quite a lot of photographs. When we talk about what else was going on in 1984, it was Dorval and Dean, it was Spitting Image, which I said on Thursday, it seemed to me when Spitting Image was on the TV, everybody knew who the politicians were. Nowadays we don't know what the faces are, we don't know half their names, and they all say the same thing, and does it really matter? In those days it did matter much more. We talk about the birth of independent living. I'll just go through these quickly. So that's one of the few photos we've got of Simon Brissenden. In fact, until about a month ago, it was the only photo we had. We've now got about 4 or 5. We also talk at some detail about how we got the building we're in today. That's a very, for me, very interesting and long story, but they said we couldn't manage it. It took us a year to persuade the powers that be that actually we knew what we were doing, and lo and behold, 10 years later we've got a very successful building and a base for our organisation and a number of other organisations that do different things around the subject of independent living. And as I say, there's poems and I won't go through that now. I appreciate we're stacked for time. And that's the history book, and we're launching that today. As I say, you'll all have a mug there in the corner by Simon and Steve to take home with you with a copy of that book electronically. We will be publishing it as a proper book. They are quite expensive to publish as proper books, but they do look good, I think. Have a look through those. If you are interested in a paper copy, then speak to either myself or Leslie, and we'll see what we can do. Okay, so if you are interested, and obviously particularly for those that don't have electronic computers and the like, then we'd be very happy to see what we can do to make those accessible, even if you don't have computers.